Hello, I'm Andy Sophia Fontaine, editor of Iceland Review. Last Sunday, our government collapsed. That's right. So what happens next? We'll talk about that and much more in this episode of Iceland News Review. I'm here at Höfði, this White House that is behind me. It's our own version of the White House, well, except the president doesn't live there. In 1986, a very historic event happened here when then President Ronald Reagan met with then Premier of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, to have a summit wherein they were trying to, have peace and what have you. This was in 1986. They're filming a movie about that summit, which is really interesting because the summit itself ended very abruptly. I highly recommend reading up on this summit. If you weren't around at the time, it was historic. We were all waiting with bated breath to see the end of the Cold War or what have you. What we now know after the fact is that Gorbachev wanted to basically disarm all nuclear missiles, but he had asked for some concessions from the United States, amongst them that the United States would stop laboratory research on SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which is colloquially known as Star Wars. It involved satellites shooting lasers at missiles up in space. This later proved to be a completely unviable, unrealistic project that billions of dollars was spent in. Reagan didn't want to give that up, and so the talks ended very abruptly. But the good thing is that both sides pretty much demonstrated to one another everything that they were willing to concede. So the talks that followed later were much more successful, and so this was quite a turning point in the Cold War. And so it's understandable that they would want to do an entire film about this event. They'll be closing off this area tomorrow to do shooting, and amongst the people that are going to be here, I'm personally most excited about J.K. Simmons being right here in Iceland. He'll be playing then U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz. I think he was Secretary of State anyway. And J.K. Simmons he's a genius, and I'm just sharing the same country with him has me pretty excited. So that's why we're here today, to show you this place where international history was made in Iceland, and it's very few occasions in world history where we can say that. But next is our top story of the day. Last Sunday, Prime Minister and the chair of the Independence Party, Bjarni Benediktsson, announced that his party was leaving the ruling coalition, which effectively meant that the government had collapsed. So how did this happen exactly? Well, we have to go back to 2017 for this. That was the first time this coalition was formed. And this coalition, in case you didn't know, is led by the Left Green Party with the Independence Party and the Progressive Party. And at the time, it was somewhat of a controversial coalition, shall we say, because the Left Greens and these three parties had historically not gotten along very well, to say the least. But nonetheless, they had a successful coalition, which, interestingly enough, came from snap elections that also happened as a result of a government collapsing in 2017. And that government in 2017 had only lasted a year, following another snap election in 2016. So as you can see, this is kind of like a national sport for us to break up our governments. Anyway, so now come 2021, there is elections. These parties, again, won enough seats to form the coalition again. Apparently, enough people were satisfied with the job they'd done the first time around to give them a full term. But the cracks began to appear during this term, and you could safely say that this began in June 2023, when then Minister of Fisheries, Svandís Svavarsdóttir of the Left Greens, introduced a sudden ban on fin whale hunting. You might remember this from the reporting last year. And this angered the Independence Party a great deal. And there was a lot of back and forth about this, and the parliamentary ombudsman at the time later ruled that this ban was unlawfully executed. But the government soldiered on, and tensions rose even further a few weeks ago when the Left Greens had their party convention. And Svandís introduced this idea that as chair of the party, she would introduce a measure before the leaders of the different coalition parties that they have elections in the spring. As it was, elections were scheduled for autumn of 2025. But once this idea got out there about early elections, all bets were off. Chaos ensued. Like, people within the left Greens were saying, well, why don't we just break up the coalition now? Why don't we just why are we waiting? And it kind of makes sense. They pretty much announced we want to have early elections, but Svandís' idea was that the three parties would come to an agreement to have elections in 2025, to give everyone enough time to prepare and what have you. But the final straw came as a result of the halted deportation of Yazan Tamimi. As reported last time, this was a disabled Palestinian child and his family who were slated to be deported for very complicated reasons. You can watch the last video to learn more about that, but the deportation was halted at the behest of the Minister of Justice, Gudrun Hafsteinsdottir, and it turned out that Minister of Social Affairs, Guðmundur Ingi Guðbrandsson, was also involved in this. He had called the Chief of Police, and Bjarni Benediktsson, the Prime Minister, had given the okay for this. And again, the opposition in particular began to raise questions about whether or not the Minister of Justice had the legal authority to halt this deportation, which is really, it's something. I won't get into all the details of that now, but that became the final straw in the end. And so what happens next? Well, the government is formally ended. Parliament is not in session. And so there needs to be a caretaker government before the elections can happen. Those elections will take place on November 30th. So normally the three parties, they would just kind of be like this lame duck government, soldiering on, doing their thing, but the left Greens opted to just leave the caretaker government altogether. They're just, the people who are currently ministers in the left Greens are just going to go back to being regular members of Parliament. They don't want any part of this partnership, excuse me, anymore. And so we're pretty much just going to soldier on until November 30th. All the parties are now in high campaign mode right now, trying to get their message out, get voters to the polls, and the results are going to be, could be pretty interesting, especially as the Social Democratic Party looks set to win the lion's share of Parliament's 63 seats. They have been at the top of the polls since January 2023. So if, and that's a big if, those polls bear out on election day, they could have their pick of the litter in terms of what party, or parties even, to partner with to form Iceland's new government. We'll just have to wait and see, keep our fingers crossed that the next government will be a bit more stable. Polar bears are back in the news once again. Two tourists who were in Laugafell in northeast Snæfell in the vicinity of Kirkjufoss in West Iceland, alerted police that they believed they saw not one but two polar bears wandering around there. Now, for the unfamiliar, polar bears are not native to Iceland, but they do sometimes show up here. They can get most of the way from Greenland through pack ice, although polar bears are also very strong swimmers. They can swim for hundreds of kilometers if need be. And so them landing here is not, I wouldn't say common, but it's not rare either. And so there was an immediate search that went underway. Police scoured the area. There were rescue helicopters looking everywhere for signs of these polar bears. No signs were found, however, which can sometimes be worrying because polar bears are usually very good at camouflage, although, there's not much snow around here right now. However, there was just enough snow for an optical illusion to be created, and that's what the police believe that these tourists actually saw. They believe that these tourists did not in fact see two polar bears, that they saw snow. So a sigh of relief for everybody involved, least of all the world's polar bear populations, because when polar bears do show up here, they're not captured, they're not shot with a tranquilizer gun and then whisked away back to Greenland or Jan Mayen or wherever they came from. We kill them instead, which is unfortunate, but that's the practice that's done these days. I'm coming down. Now we've got some astronomy news for you. A comet that is C/2023 A3, also known as Sushinshan Atlas, is visible in many parts of the world. If you like to follow astronomy related stuff on social media, you've probably seen a lot of gorgeous shots of this comet, and taken from lots of places around the world. It's also visible here in Iceland, clouds permitting. And this comet itself was first discovered in early 2023, and it's believed to originate from the Oort cloud, which is a theorized sphere of planetesimals and ice particles that surrounds the entire solar system. And it's believed that many, if not most, if not all, of our comets come from this Oort cloud. Well, probably not all of our comets, but a lot of them anyways. And this is one such comet. It is visible from Iceland. The astronomer, our star astronomer here in Iceland, Sævar Helgi Bragason, has pointers, and I'll link to this in the description, so you can check it out for yourself if you happen to be in Iceland at this time. His team advises that you should look in the west-southwest portion of the sky from twilight onwards, and you'll be able to see this comet up until November 4th. Bear in mind, however, that as the days progress, the comet will be visible higher and higher up in the sky, and as that progresses, it will get fainter and fainter. So if you happen to be here during that time, that's where you have to look. I'll give more detailed information in the description of this video for you to check out yourself. And if you happen to take any cool photos of this comet from here in Iceland, please let us know. We would be happy to share them. And I'm personally pretty excited. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm still looking out for it. We now have stricter rules in place when it comes to ice cave tours. The reason for this is, you may remember last August, there was a tragic accident at Breda Merkajökull Glacier. Just outside of an ice cave, an ice wall collapsed, killing one person and severely injuring another. It was absolutely horrible. And in the wake of this, all parties involved, including Vatnajökull National Park in southeast Iceland, and the tourist authorities and different tour companies, decided jointly to put new regulations in place. Now, under the new terms, the companies must appoint an experienced lead guide to participate in the group. They have to do safety assessments every single day, going out to that site, checking it out, making sure that everything is structurally sound daily. And if they're not, then they have to call it off. As a result of this, it's generally safer to visit these ice caves in the colder months of the year. And that's also happens to be I don't know, the most beautiful time to go. So I would advise going from early November until early spring. That's not only going to be the coldest time and thus the safest time to go, it also happens to be the most beautiful time to go, to see the snow everywhere. And when you do book your ice cave tour, you should check out the sponsor of this episode, Blue Car Rental, for all your car rental needs. We've linked to them in the description. And so with this, we have tour companies, we have tourist authorities, we have the national park itself, making sure that every single day, any site where visitors to Iceland are going to be going, that this site is going to be 100% safe, which means it's going to be a lot more fun for everybody involved. Some good news for the people of Grindvik. Grindvik will be open again from 6 a.m. October 21st. Now, as you may remember, the entire town was evacuated last November 11th on account of, the earthquakes and volcanic eruptions that were happening down there. And since then, what we've seen is, as you've probably been familiar, there have been a lot of eruptions this year, but they've been getting further and further apart. There's a lot more earthen dams that are in place protecting the town, and the eruptions appear to be moving further north from the town itself, and so it's believed that it is safe to live there once again. However, there are still some safety measures in place. Like, people are advised to stay on the town streets and avoid wide open spaces and private property. There's be signs all over the place indicating to people where exits are, if in the event that they once again need to suddenly flee, which, 7913, skjønner þrettán, as we say in Iceland, which is like knock on wood. They won't have to. There are no plans to reopen the schools or kindergartens or recreational activities, but the town is effectively open once again, and hopefully this will mean a brighter future for the town of Grindvik. Eventually they'll be able to fully reopen again, and everybody in this country is really hoping that Grindvik will have a future. Following the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Iceland opened its borders to Ukrainian refugees, but not just human refugees. There was also a policy put in place by the Icelandic Food and Veterinary Authority, also known as MAST, that people could bring their pets with them, but not without some caveats. Normally, when you bring your pet to Iceland, whether it's a dog or a cat or what have you, this animal must be quarantined for a period of 2 weeks while they test it and make sure that it doesn't have any contagions that could infect other animals in the country. Well, for Ukrainians, their pets needed to be quarantined for at least 3 weeks, and that was if they, seemed to be completely healthy. Some pets were quarantined for a period of up to 90 days. Now, what kind of pets were brought here? Well, according to the data, 23 applications for pets were filed, and ultimately 18 pets arrived, 12 dogs and 6 cats. 13 of them had to go through the 90-day quarantine. But if you're a pet owner, this may seem frivolous to those who maybe don't have a pet in their lives, but if you are a pet owner, you would probably agree that your pets are just as much a member of your family as the human beings in your lives, and the thought of leaving them behind to go to another country, let alone leaving them behind in a war zone to go to another country, is probably a pretty heartbreaking thought. And so, I don't know, I thought this was a really compassionate measure that was instituted by the government, keeping in mind that everyone around the world sees their pets as members of their families. Lastly, on Iceland News Review, another animal news story. So, in the early morning hours at the household appliances and electronics store Ormsson here in Reykjavik, staff arrived to see that the front glass doors had been smashed. And they went inside but discovered that nothing was stolen. And so they were first not sure whether this was vandalism or maybe a foiled burglary attempt. But then they looked at the security cam footage, and what they saw was probably the last thing that they thought. I'm going to link directly to this story in the description, rather than as well as our own story on it, but I'm going to link directly to this Icelandic news story because you have to see the video of this. This has to be seen to be believed. But what you see is the security camera from inside of the store pointing at the front glass doors. And out in the parking lot, you see a dog running towards the front doors, and attached to the dog is a leash, and the leash is attached to a metal bollard of some kind. And this dog is hauling it, just running full bore at these front doors. But it gets to the doors and it stops, but in the momentum, the steel bollard swings forward and smashes both of these doors. And the dog just sits there looking both like frightened and kind of a little bit ashamed, because if you own a dog, like when a dog destroys something, it knows that it's done something bad. And especially as you see two people approaching shortly thereafter, one of them picks up the dog, one of them picks up the bollard, and they walk in the other direction. Well, the managing director of Ormsson, Kjartan Sigurðsson, took this well, saying that the dog realized what he'd done, he was startled by all the noise, and disappeared with his tail between his legs. Well, that's all I have for you today on Iceland News Review. I'll see you next week. You have a great weekend and be good to each other.